A strict airline captain accuses a black teen of trespassing in the pilot's lounge, but she has no idea who he really is. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Stay tuned for the shocking twist. Jordan Mitchell had been dreaming of this day for as long as he could remember. At 17 years old, he wasn't like most teenagers. While others spent their free time scrolling through social media or playing video games, Jordan spent his nights studying aviation charts, memorizing flight routes, and perfecting his skills on a flight simulator. His dream? To become a commercial airline pilot. And today was supposed to be the first step toward making that dream a reality. The opportunity of a lifetime. Skyway Airlines, one of the largest commercial airlines in the country, had launched an exclusive career mentorship program designed to give aspiring young pilots a behind-the-scenes look at the aviation industry. Jordan had written a winning essay, beating out hundreds of applicants. The reward? A full-access tour of Skyway Airlines operations, a meet and greet with real pilots, and, if all went well, a chance to sit in the cockpit of a Boeing 777. For Jordan, this wasn't just a fun experience. It was his future unfolding before him. A dream begins. The day had started off better than he could have imagined. His tour guide, Ms. Tanya Reynolds, an HR representative, had been impressed with his knowledge of aircraft models and aviation history. "You know," she had said with a smile, "I think you might know more about aviation than some of our new hires." Jordan had beamed with pride, his heart swelling at the idea that he was finally where he belonged. Together, they toured the control tower, observed ground operations, and even visited the maintenance hangar, where a team of engineers worked on a massive Boeing 787. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. The wrong place at the wrong time around noon, Ms. Reynolds had received an urgent phone call. "Jordan, I have to handle something real quick. Just wait here in the pilot's lounge. There's a great aviation documentary playing on the TV. You'll love it." She had smiled reassuringly before stepping away. Jordan had nodded eagerly, settling into a comfortable chair, completely engrossed in the documentary. He barely noticed as pilots and flight crew came and went, heading out for their scheduled flights. Within minutes, he was completely alone in the lounge. That's when Captain Linda Dawson walked in. The accusation. Captain Dawson, a senior pilot with over 20 years of experience, took one look at Jordan, a black teenager sitting alone in the lounge, and immediately assumed the worst. Her eyes narrowed, her expression hardened. Without hesitation, she marched across the room and switched off the TV, cutting off the narrator mid-sentence. Jordan jerked his head up, startled. "How did you get in here?" Dawson demanded, her tone sharp and authoritative. Jordan blinked, confused. Ms. Reynolds told me to wait here. I'm part of the career mentorship program." Dawson didn't even acknowledge his words. Instead, she snatched the visitor badge from around his neck, breaking the lanyard clip in the process. Jordan's heart pounded as his badge clattered onto the floor. What was happening? What had he done wrong? A crime he didn't commit. Captain Dawson held up the badge, examining it as if it were counterfeit. "This has to be fake," she muttered. "There's no way they gave this clearance level to someone like you." The emphasis on "someone like you" hit Jordan like a punch to the gut. His hands trembled as he tried again to explain. I wrote an essay and won the competition. Ms. Reynolds said I could be here. Please, you can call her to check." But Dawson wasn't listening. Instead, she grabbed her radio. "Security, I have an unauthorized individual in the pilot's lounge. Possible security breach." Fear sets. In Jordan's stomach dropped. Security? They thought he was a security threat. He looked around frantically, hoping someone would vouch for him. But the lounge was empty. No witnesses. No one to back him up. All he could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had studied every FAA regulation, memorized every commercial aircraft model, and worked his entire life to prove he belonged in this world. And now he was being treated like a criminal for sitting in a lounge and watching TV. The moment that changed everything. The radio crackled. "Copy that, Captain Dawson. Officers en route." Jordan's breath hitched. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. This was supposed to be the best day of his life. Instead, he was about to be escorted out of the airport by security, possibly arrested, all because one pilot refused to believe he belonged. His hands clenched into fists, but not out of anger, out of fear, because he had seen how situations like this could go terribly wrong. He had seen the news stories. He had heard his mother's warnings. "Stay calm, Jordan. Always stay calm. Never give them a reason to see you as a threat." So he did the only thing he could. He reached for his phone. The call that changed everything. With shaking fingers, Jordan dialed the one person who could help him. "Mom," he whispered when she picked up. Something in his tone must have sent alarm bells ringing, because her voice immediately sharpened. "Jordan? What's wrong?" I need you at Terminal C right now." Silence, then a single response. "I'm on my way." Jordan swallowed hard and ended the call. As he looked up, Captain Dawson stood there, arms crossed, smirking slightly. "You can call whoever you want," she said dismissively. "Security will be here any minute." She had no idea who she was dealing with, because in just a few minutes, everything in that room was about to change. And Jordan Mitchell was no longer the one who had to be afraid. Stay tuned, because when his mother arrives, the power shift will be unlike anything this pilot has ever seen. Public humiliation and fear. The moment Jordan Mitchell ended the call with his mother, his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure how long it would take her to get to Terminal C, but every second that passed felt like an eternity. Across the room, Captain Linda Dawson stood with her arms crossed, her expression smug. "Hope you didn't think calling for backup was going to change anything," she sneered. "Security is already on their way." Jordan swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, watching, judging. A few airline employees had gathered near the entrance of the pilot's lounge, whispering amongst themselves. Others pretended not to stare, but Jordan could feel their curiosity burning through him. Was this really happening? Was he really being treated like a criminal for nothing more than waiting in a lounge he was authorized to be in? The walk of shame. Within 2 minutes, 2 uniformed security officers entered the lounge, their radios buzzing softly. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture stiff and professional. The other was shorter, but just as intimidating, his hand resting near the baton on his utility belt. Jordan tried not to panic. He had read too many news stories. He knew how badly situations like this could escalate. His mother had given him the talk years ago. "Stay calm, don't argue. Keep your hands where they can see them." But at this moment, Jordan was struggling to remember how to breathe. The taller officer scanned the room, his gaze landing on Captain Dawson. "You the one who called this in?" Dawson nodded stiffly, her voice sharp. "Yes, this young man was found unauthorized in a restricted area. I believe he may have gained access with a fraudulent badge." Jordan's stomach twisted into knots. Fraudulent? This was beyond unfair. It was a flat-out lie. Still, he didn't move. He knew that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. Interrogation in the open. The officer turned to Jordan, his expression unreadable. "Name and reason for being here?" Jordan tried to steady his voice, but he could already feel it wavering. "My name is Jordan Mitchell. I'm here for the Skyway Airlines Career Mentorship Program. Ms. Reynolds, my tour guide, told me to wait here while she handled something. I have a valid visitor badge." Dawson let out a laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "A high school kid with access to the pilot's lounge? That's not how security clearance works. Jordan clenched his jaw. She was making it sound ridiculous on purpose. The shorter security officer motioned to his badge. "Let's see it." Jordan hesitated. "My badge. It was taken from me." The officer frowned. "Who took it?" Jordan turned his gaze to Captain Dawson. There was a brief silence. For the first time, Dawson's smug expression faltered just slightly. The taller officer shifted his gaze toward her. "Captain, do you have his badge?" Dawson rolled her eyes, pulling the badge out of her pocket and holding it up. "I was verifying its authenticity," she said smoothly. The officer took it from her, examining it. His eyes moved between Jordan's ID photo and his face. Jordan held his breath, hoping, praying, that this would clear everything up. Finally, the officer spoke. "Looks legitimate to me." Jordan exhaled, relief flooding his chest. Maybe this nightmare was about to end, but Captain Dawson wasn't about to let that happen. "Just because it looks real doesn't mean it is," she snapped. "I don't think he belongs here." Those words hit Jordan like a slap to the face. He didn't belong. Because of what? His age? His race? His presence in a space she didn't think he deserved to be in? The short officer stepped forward, his stance firm. "Son, I need you to be honest with us," he said. "Did you use someone else's badge to get in here?" Jordan's heart sank. He could see it in their eyes. They were already doubting him. "No," Jordan said, his voice quieter now. "I would never do that." Dawson folded her arms, clicking her tongue in disapproval. "He was in here alone, watching TV like he owned the place," she scoffed. "I knew something was off the second I walked in." The crowd grows by now. More airline employees had gathered. Pilots, flight attendants, ground crew. They whispered amongst themselves, watching as Jordan was questioned in front of everyone. Jordan could feel their judgment, their suspicion. One flight attendant leaned into another and muttered, "Did he really sneak in?" Jordan's ears burned. This was humiliation on a level he had never experienced before. He wasn't just being accused, he was being shamed in front of a crowd. Captain Dawson turned to the officers. "I want him removed from this area," she said firmly. "This lounge is for authorized personnel. He doesn't belong here." Those words again. He doesn't belong here. Jordan looked at the ground, feeling a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just about today. This was about every time he had ever felt like an outsider, every time someone had questioned his right to be in a space, every time someone had looked at him and assumed the worst. And now it was happening right here, in the one place he had dreamed of belonging. The fear sets in Jordan suddenly had a terrifying realization. If they removed him from this lounge, if they wrote up a security report, what would happen next? Would it be on his record? Would he be banned from Skyway Airlines? Would this ruin his chance of ever becoming a pilot? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. I just want to call my mom," he murmured, barely able to get the words out. The officers exchanged glances. The taller one sighed. "Fine. Make it quick." Jordan fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to unlock the screen. He hit redial. The phone barely rang twice before his mother answered. "Jordan! I'm almost there. What's happening?" Her voice was steady but laced with concern. Jordan took a deep breath. They think I snuck in," he whispered, blinking hard to stop the sting in his eyes. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then in a voice calm but commanding, his mother responded. "Give them the phone." Jordan looked up, his heart pounding. He held the phone out to the officer. "My mom wants to talk to you." The officer took the phone, pressing it to his ear. A second later, his entire posture changed. His eyes widened. He straightened up. "Yes, ma'am," he said quickly. Then his expression completely shifted, from authority to uneasy realization. Something had just changed, and Captain Dawson was about to find out exactly who Jordan Mitchell's mother was. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The power shift. The CEO arrives. Jordan Mitchell stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest as the security officer held his phone to his ear. The officer's entire posture changed the moment he heard the voice on the other end. "Yes, ma'am," he said quickly, his grip on the phone tightening. His once confident expression had shifted into something uncertain, almost nervous. Jordan couldn't hear what his mother was saying, but whatever it was making the officer very uncomfortable. Across the room, Captain Linda Dawson narrowed her eyes, folding her arms. "What's the holdup?" she asked impatiently. "Get him out of here." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he stiffened, then turned to his partner and whispered something. The second officer's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and suddenly the entire energy in the room shifted. Jordan noticed it immediately. It was subtle at first, a shift in body language, a slight hesitation in movement, but then it grew stronger, like a wave rippling through the air. Something had changed, something big. The arrival that stunned everyone. A voice crackled over the security officer's radio. "All units, hold position. VIP approaching." VIP? Jordan's pulse quickened. Captain Dawson's smirk faded slightly, a hint of confusion flashing across her face. "What VIP?" she muttered, looking around. That's when the doors to the pilot's lounge swung open, and in walked the last person Captain Dawson ever expected to see. Rachel Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer of Skyway Airlines, and Jordan's mother. A room frozen in shock. Rachel Mitchell didn't just enter the room, she commanded it. She walked with purpose, her navy blue business suit perfectly tailored, her heels clicking against the polished floor with every measured step. Her presence alone was enough to make the entire room fall silent. Whispers started immediately. "Wait, is that? Oh my God, that's Rachel Mitchell. The CEO? Why is she here?" Jordan's breath caught in his throat. His mother wasn't just a powerful woman in aviation, she was a legend. She had started as a flight attendant, worked her way up to pilot, then climbed the corporate ladder until she became one of the most influential CEOs in the airline industry. But right now, she wasn't here as the CEO of Skyway Airlines. She was here as a mother who had just been told that her son was being treated like a criminal in her own company, and she did not look happy. The tables turned. Rachel walked straight past the security officers, past the stunned pilots and flight attendants, and stopped right in front of Captain Dawson. For the first time, Dawson looked uneasy. Rachel's eyes locked onto hers, cold, unwavering. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but lethal. "That's my son," she said. "Would you like to explain to me why he's being interrogated?" Silence. Dawson opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked around the room as if hoping for backup, but no one spoke. No one came to her defense. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, Captain Dawson was no longer in control, and she knew it. A harsh reality check. Rachel turned to the security officers. "Who called this in?" The taller officer hesitated. "Captain Dawson reported an unauthorized individual in the pilot's lounge, ma'am." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Unauthorized?" she echoed, turning back to Dawson. "You do realize that my son is here as part of the career mentorship program? That he was personally invited by my HR team? That he was waiting exactly where his tour guide told him to wait?" Dawson's face turned pale. I wasn't aware." Rachel held up a hand, cutting her off immediately. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she said, her voice sharp and precise. "You weren't aware. You didn't check. You didn't ask questions. You just saw a black teenager sitting in the pilot's lounge and assumed he didn't belong." The room was dead silent. Dawson flushed red, but Rachel wasn't done. She stepped closer, her eyes locked onto Dawson's. "Tell me something, Captain," she said. "If my son had looked different, would you have done the same thing?" Dawson stiffened. You had his badge," Rachel continued. "You could have checked his credentials, called HR, verified his presence here. But instead, you humiliated him in front of a room full of people." She let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Is that how you represent Skyway Airlines?" Dawson swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a tight line. She had no answer, because the truth was right there for everyone to see. The final shift in power. Rachel turned back to Jordan. For the first time since this nightmare started, he finally felt safe. His mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, then turned back to the security officers. "Release him, now." The taller officer nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am." Jordan let out a shaky breath as the tension in his chest began to ease. It was over. He was finally free. But his mother wasn't done yet. Rachel turned back to Captain Dawson one last time. "You will be hearing from HR," she said simply. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending an internal review." Dawson's eyes widened. "Suspended? But this isn't a discussion," Rachel cut her off. "This is accountability." With that, she turned to Jordan. "Let's go." As they walked toward the door, Jordan risked one final glance back. Captain Dawson stood frozen, her entire career crumbling in front of her. Jordan had walked into this lounge feeling powerless, humiliated and afraid. But now he was walking out with his head held high. The aftermath. As they exited the lounge, Rachel took a deep breath and turned to her son. "Are you okay?" Jordan nodded. "I am now." Rachel studied him for a moment, then sighed. "This should have never happened to you," she said, "and I'm going to make sure it never happens to anyone else." Jordan knew she meant it, because when Rachel Mitchell made a promise, things changed, and after today, Skyway Airlines would never be the same again. But the fight wasn't over yet. Stay tuned, because the real consequences were just beginning. On fire. A reckoning for the captain. Captain Linda Dawson stood frozen in place, her face pale as the weight of reality crashed down on her. Just moments ago, she had been the one in control, the authority in the room, the figure everyone deferred to. But now she stood before Rachel Mitchell, the CEO of Skyway Airlines, and the mother of the boys she had just humiliated. The shift in power was undeniable, and for the first time in her career, Dawson was truly afraid. No more excuses. Rachel stared her down, her eyes cold and calculating. The room had gone completely silent, every employee holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Tell me, Captain Dawson," Rachel said, her voice smooth but sharp. "Is this how you usually handle security concerns?" Dawson swallowed hard. I asked you a question," Rachel cut in. "Is this your standard protocol?" Dawson hesitated. If she said yes, she would be admitting that she regularly treated people this way. If she said no, she would be admitting that this incident was personal. Either way, she was trapped. A career on the brink. Rachel glanced at the security officers. "Did she verify his identity before calling you?" The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. "No, ma'am," he admitted. "She reported him as an unauthorized individual without checking his credentials." Rachel turned back to Dawson. "You had his badge," she said. "You could have checked his information in less than 60 seconds, but instead you called security and publicly humiliated him." Dawson felt her throat tighten. I thought it was fake," she muttered, scrambling for an excuse. Rachel tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You thought?" she echoed. "Or you assumed?" Dawson had no answer, because the truth was right in front of everyone. A public humiliation. The gathered employees, the pilots, the flight attendants, the ground crew, all stood watching. Many of them looked uncomfortable, because deep down they knew what had happened. They had seen it before, the snap judgments, the assumptions, the way people like Jordan were treated differently. But now the one who had done it was finally being held accountable. Rachel took a slow step forward. "My son," she said, "is 16 years old, a high school student. He was here for a mentorship program. He was sitting quietly, doing exactly what his tour guide instructed him to do. And you treated him like a criminal." Dawson's lips pressed into a tight line. I didn't know he was your son," she blurted out. The second the words left her mouth, she knew she had made a mistake. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "So if he had been someone else's son, this would have been okay?" Dawson's face drained of color. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. Rachel let the silence hang in the air for a long, excruciating moment. Then, in a voice calm but deadly, she said, "But that's exactly what you just said. The consequences begin." Rachel turned toward one of the airline executives who had accompanied her. "Effective immediately, Captain Dawson is suspended without pay while HR conducts a full investigation," she announced. A stunned gasp rippled through the crowd. Dawson's eyes widened in shock. "Suspended?" she choked out. Rachel's gaze was ice cold. "Yes," she said simply. "Suspended." Dawson shook her head, trying to regain control of the situation. "Wait, you can't just... I've been with this airline for 20 years, and you should have learned better judgment by now," Rachel replied, her tone cutting. The executive next to her nodded solemnly, already taking notes. "HR will review your past conduct," Rachel continued. "I want full reports on any prior complaints or incidents related to bias, misconduct, or inappropriate behavior." Dawson opened her mouth ready to argue. But then she saw it. The looks on the faces of her colleagues. Some were avoiding eye contact. Others watched with satisfaction. They had all seen how she acted. And now no one was stepping up to defend her. She was alone. Completely alone. The reality sets in. Dawson exhaled sharply, trying to keep her composure. "This is overkill," she muttered, shaking her head. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because I'm sure Jordan felt the same way when he was being interrogated in front of a crowd." Dawson's cheeks burned. Rachel turned to one of the senior flight instructors. "Captain Johnson," she said, addressing a respected pilot nearby, "I'd like you to take over Dawson's routes until further notice." Captain Amara Johnson, a tall black woman in uniform, stepped forward and nodded professionally. "It would be my pleasure, ma'am." Dawson's stomach dropped. Her replacement had already been chosen. This wasn't just a suspension. This was the beginning of the end. The final words, Rachel took one last look at Dawson. Her voice when she spoke was measured and final. "You will never treat another young black man this way again in my airline." Then she turned and walked away. The security officers escorted Dawson toward HR, her career hanging by a thread. Jordan watched her go, his chest still tight with emotion. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was justice. For once, someone like him wasn't the one walking away in shame. For once, the person in power was held accountable, and Skyway Airlines would never be the same again. But the fight wasn't over yet. Stay tuned, because the real changes were just beginning. Transforming a moment into change. The aftermath of Captain Dawson's suspension rippled through every corner of Skyway Airlines. Employees whispered about it in break rooms. Pilots exchanged glances in the hallways. Flight attendants sent quiet nods of acknowledgement when they passed Jordan and his mother. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about years of unspoken bias. Years of people like Jordan being doubted, questioned, and treated differently. But now something was finally changing, and Rachel Mitchell wasn't going to stop here. A CEO on a mission. The next morning, Rachel called for an emergency executive meeting. Her leadership team gathered in the company's top-floor conference room, the city's skyline stretching beyond the massive glass windows. The atmosphere was tense. They all knew why they were there. Rachel didn't waste time. She placed both hands on the polished oak table and looked each executive in the eye. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday," she said, her voice calm but firm. A few executives shifted in their seats. Some had been at the airport when it all unfolded. Others had watched it play out on security footage later that night. One executive, Mr. Donovan, head of human resources, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I understand that Captain Dawson's behavior was unacceptable, and I fully support the decision to suspend her, but—" Rachel raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "This isn't just about Captain Dawson," she said. "This is about the culture we've allowed to grow in this company." Silence. Rachel's voice grew sharper. How many other employees have faced the same kind of treatment Jordan did? How many of our young interns, new hires, or employees of color have been humiliated, doubted, or dismissed simply because of who they are? No one answered, because they all knew the truth. And Rachel was done ignoring it. A plan for real change. Rachel took a deep breath. "We're going to fix this," she announced, "and we're going to start today." She turned to Lisa Carter, the company's chief diversity officer. "Lisa, I want a full-scale review of our hiring, training, and promotion processes. We're not just checking boxes for diversity. I want real inclusion." Lisa nodded firmly. "Yes, ma'am." Rachel turned to Mr. Donovan. "We're also overhauling our bias training program. The old PowerPoint slides aren't enough. Every manager, pilot, and employee will be required to undergo interactive, real-world scenario training, starting with the leadership team." Donovan looked momentarily surprised. "You want executives to go through the same training?" Rachel's eyes darkened. "I want everyone to go through it," she corrected, "including myself." A murmur swept through the room. Most CEOs would never put themselves through the same training as entry-level employees. But Rachel wasn't most CEOs. And she wasn't asking. She was making it happen. The launch of the Next Generation program. Rachel turned to Captain Amara Johnson, the senior pilot who had stepped in to replace Captain Dawson. "I want you to head a new mentorship program," she said, "one that actively recruits young talent, especially from underrepresented backgrounds, and pairs them with experienced pilots." Captain Johnson's eyes lit up. "I would be honored," she said. Rachel nodded. "Good," she said, "because this isn't just about fixing a problem. It's about making sure the next generation of pilots never faces what Jordan faced." Addressing the entire company. Later that afternoon, Rachel stood before hundreds of Skyway Airlines employees in a town hall meeting. Behind her, a massive screen displayed an image of Jordan's visitor badge, the same one Captain Dawson had torn from his neck. She took a deep breath, then spoke. "What happened to my son yesterday was unacceptable," she began. The room was silent. She scanned the crowd, making sure everyone felt the weight of her words. "But let's be honest with ourselves. This isn't just about my son. This is about every employee, customer, and trainee who has ever been dismissed, disrespected, or made to feel like they don't belong." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We can't call ourselves a world-class airline if our culture doesn't reflect that," she continued. "We don't just fly planes. We connect people. And that starts with making sure every single person, no matter their background, feels like they belong here." The audience nodded. Some even applauded softly. Rachel raised her chin. "So here's what's going to happen." She outlined every change coming to the company. Mandatory bias training for all employees, including executives. A mentorship program to support young aviators from underrepresented backgrounds. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and biased behavior. And finally, a public commitment to creating a culture of inclusion at every level of the company. By the time she finished speaking, the entire room was on their feet. Thunderous applause filled the space, because for the first time, employees knew this wasn't just corporate talk. This was real. Rachel Mitchell meant every word. A new beginning. That night, Jordan sat across from his mother in her office, watching the city lights blink through the massive windows. "You really did all of that?" he asked, still trying to process the events of the day. Rachel smiled softly. "I did," she said. "And it's just the beginning." Jordan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I still can't believe everything that happened," he admitted. "Yesterday, I thought my whole future was ruined. And today, it's like I helped change something." Rachel reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You did change something, Jordan," she said. "Your experience forced this company to look in the mirror. And now? Now we're making sure no one else has to go through what you did." Jordan nodded. For the first time since the nightmare in the pilot's lounge, he felt something different. He felt hope. Skyway Airlines would never be the same again, and that was a good thing. But the journey wasn't over yet. Stay tuned, because the fight for real change was just getting started. The lesson: fear shouldn't be a barrier to dreams. Jordan Mitchell sat quietly in his mother's office, staring out at the city lights shimmering through the massive windows. It had been a long, exhausting day, a day that started with fear and humiliation and ended with justice and change. But even now, as he tried to process everything, one thought kept running through his mind. What if his mother hadn't been the CEO? What if she had been just another parent? Would anyone have believed him? Would anyone have fought for him? Would he still have a future in aviation? Facing the hard truth, Rachel Mitchell, still dressed in her business suit from the day's meetings, watched her son closely. She could see the thoughts racing behind his eyes. She knew exactly what he was thinking, because once upon a time, she had thought the same thing. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know what you're feeling right now," she said. Jordan turned to look at her. She met his gaze, her expression soft but serious. "You're wondering if this would have turned out differently if I wasn't the CEO," she continued. Jordan nodded slowly. "I mean, yeah," he admitted. "If you hadn't walked in, if you weren't who you are, would they have even listened to me?" Rachel was silent for a moment. Then she answered honestly. "I don't know," she said. Jordan blinked, surprised by her honesty. Rachel leaned forward, folding her hands together on the desk. "But that's exactly why we're making these changes," she continued. "Because fear of being doubted, fear of being dismissed, fear of being treated differently, should never be the price of following your dreams." Jordan let that sink in. Her own battle against fear. Rachel took a deep breath, then shared something she rarely talked about. "When I first started training as a pilot, I was often the only woman in the room, and almost always the only black woman," she said. Jordan straightened, listening carefully. "There was a chief instructor who didn't think I belonged," she continued. "Every test, every simulation, every training exercise, he pushed me harder than the others. He questioned my competence. He made sure I knew he thought I wasn't good enough." Jordan frowned. "What did you do?" he asked. Rachel smiled faintly. "I passed," she said simply. "Top of my class." Jordan smirked, shaking his head. "Of course you did." Rachel chuckled, but then grew serious again. "But the truth is, Jordan, I was terrified every single day," she admitted. Jordan's smirk faded. "I second-guessed myself constantly. I worked twice as hard as everyone else just to prove I belonged," Rachel continued. She looked her son in the eyes. "That fear, the fear of not being accepted, of having to constantly prove myself. That's not something I want for you. Jordan swallowed hard. A promise for the future. Rachel stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the planes taking off in the distance. I built my career so that one day, kids like you wouldn't have to feel that fear, she said. Jordan watched her, his admiration growing. I don't want you, or any other young black kid who dreams of flying, to ever feel like they don't belong in the cockpit. Jordan stood up, walking over to stand beside her. But that's the thing, Mom, he said. Today, I did feel that way. Rachel sighed. I know, she said quietly. And that's why we're not stopping here. She turned to face him. We're not just changing policies at Skyway Airlines, she said. We're changing the industry. Jordan raised an eyebrow. How? Rachel smiled. Turning pain into power. First, Rachel said, we're expanding the Horizon Mentorship Program. We're going to find young people, kids like you, who dream of flying but don't have the resources or connections. And we're going to make sure they have everything they need to succeed. Jordan's eyes lit up. Seriously? Rachel nodded. We're also launching a full scholarship fund for underrepresented students in aviation, she added. And we're creating a network of pilots, engineers, and executives who will personally mentor the next generation. Jordan grinned. Mom, that's amazing. Rachel smiled back. But we're not stopping there, she said. Jordan raised an eyebrow. There's more? Rachel nodded. We're going to push for industry-wide change, she said. We're partnering with other airlines, flight schools, and aviation organizations to ensure diversity and inclusion aren't just corporate buzzwords. Jordan let out a low whistle. You don't play around, do you? Rachel chuckled. Not when it comes to something this important, she said. Jordan's new purpose. Jordan crossed his arms, deep in thought. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said. I want in. Rachel smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, she said. Jordan grinned. No, I mean it, he said. I want to help. If we're making changes, I want to be a part of it. Rachel nodded. Good, she said. Because this isn't just about fixing what happened to you. It's about making sure no one else goes through it. Jordan exhaled slowly. For the first time since the nightmare in the pilot's lounge, he felt something different. Not just relief, not just justice, hope. A sky without limits. Rachel looked back out at the runway, watching as a massive jet lifted off into the night sky. You see that? She said. Jordan followed her gaze. The sky? He asked. Rachel nodded. That sky belongs to you, she said. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. Jordan smiled. He knew there were still battles ahead. He knew not everyone would change overnight. But now he was ready, because fear would never hold him back again. And one day soon, he wouldn't just be watching planes take off. He'd be flying them. But this is just the beginning. Stay tuned, because the fight for change isn't over yet. Aviation industry sees a cultural shift. The events at Skyway Airlines had set off a chain reaction, not just within the company, but across the entire aviation industry. What had started as one unjust incident had now become a movement. And it wasn't just about Jordan Mitchell anymore. This was about changing aviation culture for good. The headlines that sparked a conversation news of Captain Dawson's suspension and Skyway Airlines' sweeping policy changes spread quickly. Major media outlets picked up the story. Airline CEO takes action after son faces discrimination in pilot's lounge. Skyway Airlines implements new diversity programs after racial bias incident. CEO Rachel Mitchell challenges the industry. Fear shouldn't be a barrier to dreams. Aviation organizations, industry leaders, and even competing airlines took notice. Because this wasn't just a PR story, it was a wake-up call. And soon others were forced to ask themselves a difficult question. Was this an isolated incident, Or was this a symptom of a larger problem? A new industry standard begins at Skyway Airlines. The changes were swift and real. Bias training became mandatory for all employees, from ground staff to senior executives. A new mentorship program connected young, underrepresented aviation students with industry veterans. Leadership roles became more diverse, ensuring different perspectives at the decision-making level. But Rachel Mitchell knew that fixing one company wasn't enough. She reached out to other airline CEOs, flight schools, and aviation organizations with a simple message: we need to do better, together. Some were hesitant, others were resistant, but many were ready for change. The impact reaches beyond Skyway. Soon other airlines began adopting similar programs. Regional airlines have started creating scholarships for young aviators from diverse backgrounds. Flight schools introduced new training initiatives to combat bias in pilot evaluations. Major carriers began tracking promotion disparities and ensuring fair opportunities. One by one, the industry began shifting, slowly but surely, because this wasn't just about one incident. This was about breaking a cycle that had existed for far too long. Jordan becomes the face of change. Meanwhile, Jordan Mitchell found himself in the spotlight. The once nervous teenager was now a symbol of resilience. He was invited to speak at aviation conferences, share his experience, and inspire other young dreamers. At first, he wasn't sure if he was ready, but then he remembered what his mother had told him. The sky belongs to you. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. So he stepped onto the stage, and he told his story, not just about what happened to him, but about why this change was necessary for everyone. And as he looked out at a crowd of future pilots, engineers, and airline professionals, he realized he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the next generation. A new era in aviation. 1 year later, the industry looked different. More diverse pilots in the cockpit, more inclusion in training programs, more opportunities for young dreamers who had once felt like they didn't belong. Rachel Mitchell had proven that real change doesn't come from words, it comes from action. And Jordan, he wasn't just watching from the sidelines anymore. He was part of the movement, because now he knew his place in the industry, not as a victim, but as a leader. The sky has room for everyone. As another plane soared overhead, Jordan smiled. He knew there was still work to be done. There would always be barriers to break, minds to change, and voices to amplify. But now he had no doubt. Aviation was changing, and this time it was changing for the better. And that's why this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. On Fire.